Hello, everybody. Yes, it's recording now. Very happy to see everybody of you here tonight. And we actually, for us here in China, we could call this lecture series Saturday Night Talks, although today it's a Friday night talk. And yes, I will be talking about actually the two most important Taoist temples in Chengdu, the provincial capital of Sichuan. And I think I should start with the screen sharing now. And here we are, here we go. So in Chengdu city, nearly everybody knows the Taoist temple Qingyang, which I translate as Palace of the Grey Goat. But most people have never heard about the monastery Archannan, or Hermitage of the Two Immortals, although the latter is only a stone's throw away from the Qingyang. The two Taoist sanctuaries stand side by side in the western part of Chengdu city, appearing now as a single entity, since the Archannan has currently no public entrance and can only be accessed through the Qingyang. Actually, the present situation of the temples echoes the earliest history of the Archannan, which was originally founded as a branch monastery of the Qingyang. However, both Taoist sanctuaries developed completely different and functioned as two separate institutions in the course of history, a status which persisted until 1949, which all of you know, when the religious life of China was thoroughly disrupted. Although the two sanctuaries were founded in different eras, I am inclined to refer to them as the Twin-Monasteries, because they share common origins and characteristics, but developed in very different ways. So both the Qingyang and the Archannan are outstanding, in as much as they not only played a crucial role in the development of modern Taoism in Sichuan, but also managed to survive into the present day. Well into the middle of the 20th century, Chengdu was covered with hundreds of temples of all sizes and affiliations. Today, by contrast, only 3, or actually 4, if we count the Archannan, officially registered Taoist temples remain in the metropolitan area of Chengdu. It is a fact that Chengdu, though being celebrated as a famous historic and cultural city, a 历史文化名城, has lost most of its historical buildings in the course of communist modernization from the 1950s through the 1990s. So among the 3 or 4 Taoist temples remaining in Chengdu city today, only the Qingyang and the Archannan still comprise relatively large historical structures. So, as many of you know, in imperial China, while only major religious institutions were supervised by the state, religious life as such was embedded in traditional values and universally shared spirituality, with the religio-political state as an ordering center of gravity, to use the words of Vincent Gossard and David Palmer, and local temple networks at the grassroots level. When these foundations were shattered by the collapse of imperial China in 1911, the intrusion of foreign powers, social reforms, and last but not least, the import of the Western, or to be precise, Christian notion of religion, China's traditional religions came under increasing pressure and had to find new allies and donors in a rapidly changing society. So this led to the emergence of new religious networks comprising temples, monasteries, spirit writing altars, redemptive societies, literati circles, and various popular religious communities. So in Sichuan, the Leoman or Liu school community was a major factor, a major actor in the fields of religion, education, and charity. Based on the Confucian erudition of a Liu family from Shuangliu district, southwest of Chengdu, Leoman became one of the most influential scholarly and spiritual traditions in the area, constituting an important part of Sichuan civil society from the early 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. A central conviction of the Leoman tradition is the fundamental inseparability of Confucianism and Taoism, regarding Lao Tzu as the preeminent teacher of Confucius. The Leoman community thus supported many Taoist temples and sometimes even managed them. Both the Qingyang and the Archannan were patronized by the Leoman community, differing in extent and manner according to the respective status of the two sanctuaries. So the interaction between Sichuan Taoism and Leoman is typical for the religious situation at that time. Although many details concerning the concrete networks or the modalities of this interaction are still obscure, we have access to epigraphical sources, which are very informative and will be analyzed in my talk tonight. However, I will begin with a brief introduction of the Twin Monasteries and the Leoman tradition. So let's begin with the Qingyang, which is traditionally considered the place of Lao Tzu's second incarnation. So it is said that Lao Tzu's eminent disciple and the first recipient of the Tao Te Ching, Yin Xi, was reportedly led to Lao Tzu, who had been reborn in the family of a local dignitary, through the agreed upon sign of a gray goat, Qingyang, also translated as green ram, azure ram, or even black sheep. After a period of intense self-cultivation, Yin Xi was thus reunited with Lao Tzu, who thereupon bestowed the rank of an accomplished immortal on his faithful disciple. So now the translation gray goat for Qingyang tries to accommodate the actual setting of the legend in the Sichuan basin, where sheep do not belong to the commonly raised livestock, but goats do. Also, two bronze statues of the Qingyang, which are kept at the Qingyang, they also resemble goats, but have nothing in common with sheep. So as to the color of the mythical animal, in the hagiographic work Hunyuan Shengji in the Taoist canon, it is described as having a shining coat of a color resembling lead or qingjin in Chinese. So according to the Taoist tradition, Yin Xi, the guardian of the Hangu Pass, once urged Lao Tzu to write down his teachings in order to hand them down to posterity, which presumably resulted in the composition of the Tao Te Ching. Based on the law of Lao Tzu's incarnations through the ages, Lao Tzu then told Yin Xi to meet him again at a place called Qingyang Si, or Great Goat Market, in today's Chengdu, after a certain period of time, led to the home of a local dignitary surnamed Li by a servant with a gray goat, which had escaped from the Li mansion. Yin Xi then recognized Lao Tzu in the Li family's infant, who immediately resumed his original divine appearance. This is what you can see on this traditional picture here on the right, which was actually printed in 1936. So, and this reportedly happened during the reign of King Zhao of the Zhou dynasty, which means in the 10th century before Common Era. However, the Qingyang Si legend was most probably fabricated during the 6th or 7th century CE. Yet in later inscriptions, as we will see, the appellation Qingyang Si was still frequently used as an elegant name of the Qingyang. Based on this legend, the Qingyang received imperial patronage during the Tang Dynasty. While very little is known about the real origins of this sanctuary, it was a Taoist temple named Xuanzhongguan, Abbey in the Center of Mystery. Then the Tang Emperor Xizong, who had fled from the rebellion of Huangchao and lived in exile in the area of modern Sichuan from 881 to 885, visited it. However, at that time, the sanctuary had largely fallen into oblivion and lost most of its lands. On the 3rd of October in 883, when a jiao or offering ritual was conducted there on imperial orders, an ancient brick was excavated at this sacred site. The mysterious object of extraordinary shape and quality bore an inscription in archaic seal script, which foretold the imminent quelling of the Huangchao rebellion and the end of Xizong's exile. The text read, "The Most High, Laozi, pacifies the disturbances of the Zhonghe reign period. Taishang Ping Zhonghe Zai." Thereupon, the sanctuary was rebuilt and extended under the aegis of Emperor Xizong, and was bestowed the name Qingyang, by which it is still known today. Yue Penggui, a prominent scholar official in Xizong's entourage, was ordered to compose a lengthy inscription of praise, which was carved on a stele to be erected inside the sanctuary. This is the famous Sichuan Qingyang Beiming, which can be found in many collections, among them the Taoist canon. So on the basis of the old Qingyang legend, the Qingyang rose to prominence and became an officially recognized Taoist abbey during the Tang Dynasty. The treasure brick miracle at this sacred site foretold the imminent restoration of the dynasty under Emperor Xizong, who would soon return to the capital after 4 years of exile in Chengdu. And this case has been extensively studied by Franciscus Verellen. The Qingyang's close relation to the Tang Dynasty is still visible today. So the Tang Wangdian, or Hall of the Tang Rulers, located on a small hill in the rear part of the temple complex, is dedicated to several Tang Dynasty emperors. Reliable information on the development of the Qingyang during the Song Dynasty is scarce. However, the temple is mentioned repeatedly in poems by the famous poet Lu You, who spent many years of his life in Sichuan. We know much more about the Qingyang's fate during the Ming and Qing dynasties. According to the 1873 district records of Chengdu, in Ming times the temple was rebuilt or renovated by the Prince of Shu, a scion of the imperial family enfeoffed with the Chengdu region. At the end of the Ming dynasty, the sanctuary was devastated by traitor Xian, Xianzei in Chinese. Traitor Xian is a common appellation for the rebel leader Zhang Xianzhong, who set up his own regime in Chengdu in 1644, and whose rebel troops were notorious for their violence and vandalism. Finally, in the 7th year of the Kangxi era under the Qing dynasty, provincial governor Zhang Dedi financed the rebuilding of the Qingyang. During the Qianlong reign period, the Qingyang underwent another major renovation. At that time, local officials entreated Taoist master Zhang Qingye to fill the position of abbot. At that time, Zhang led the Wu Houci, the ancestral temple of the Marquis of Wu, which is dedicated to the famous strategist Zhuge Liang and the former ruler of the Shu Han state, Liu Bei. The Wu Houci, today one of the major tourist attractions in Chengdu, was managed by Taoists until the middle of the 20th century. Zhang Qingye finally agreed to help with the planning of the rebuilding and the collection of donations, and he installed his disciple Wang Yicui as abbot of the Qingyang. In 1745, during the celebrations of Laozi's birthday, the Qingyang was reopened as a public monastery. So Zhang Qingye was a monk of the Leoman or Dragon Gate branch of Quanzhen or complete perfection Taoism. The Leoman branch spread rapidly across the area of Sichuan during the Kangxi reign of the Qing dynasty, and the majority of Taoist temples in this region came under the management of Leoman masters. Like other leading Taoists in Sichuan, Zhang was originally trained on Mount Wudang in Hubei province, the famous Wudangshan. Henceforth, the Qingyang Gong belonged to the Leoman lineage of Zhang Qingye. This situation persisted into the 19th and 20th centuries, when the Qingyang Gong was finally managed as a hereditary temple, the so-called Zisun Miao, and closely connected with the Leoman community. Another key figure in the spread of the Leoman lineage was Chen Qingjue, who, like Zhang Qingye, received his Taoist training on Mount Wudang and settled in Sichuan during the Kangxi reign. After Chen had successfully revived and managed the main temple on Mount Qingchangshan, he retired to the Qingyang Gong, where he lived in a thatched hut in the temple garden. There he met the government official Zhao Liangbi, who admired Chen's self-cultivation and had the Archannan or Hermitage of the Two Immortals built as a personal retreat for him in 1695. The name Two Immortals refers to Lü Dongbin and Han Xiangzi, two of the 8 immortals who were venerated by Chen Qingjue and whose statues were set up in the main hall of the new sanctuary. After Zhao Liangbi had praised Chen Qingjue's virtue at court, the Kangxi emperor bestowed a tablet inscribed with Emerald Cavern at the Cinnabar Terrace, Dan Tai Bidong, and other gifts upon Chen. These presents were among similar gifts to other monasteries brought to Sichuan in 1703 by an imperial delegation, which implied official recognition of the Archannan. It is further stated in Taoist monastic documents that the Kangxi emperor conferred the title Bidong Zhenlen, perfected of the Emerald Cavern, on Chen in 1702. But this could not be verified in official writings, and so I would hold that this is just a legend. So although the Archannan was originally founded as a subsidiary of the Qingyang Gong, it became an independent monastery, endowed with ample space and farmland by Zhao Liangbi, who also drafted official documents protecting the monastic property. Chen Qingjue became the founding patriarch of the Bidong sub-branch or Bidong Zong of Leoman, the Archannan being its center and developing independently of the Qingyang Gong. Actually, the Bidong sub-branch of Leoman henceforth constituted the most influential lineage of Quanzhen Taoism in Sichuan. Yet the Qingyang Gong later maintained its own transmission of Zhang Qingye's Leoman lineage, which must be distinguished from Chen Qingjue's Bidong sub-branch. The Archannan, its main buildings being the Lüzu Dian Hall of Patriarch Lü and the Archan Dian Hall of the Two Immortals, was repeatedly renovated and extended. In 1814, the Lüzu Hall was elevated into an official shrine for the worship of Lü Dongbin. The popular saint had been included in the canon of state sacrifices and henceforth had to receive formal offerings in spring and autumn in designated sanctuaries. In fact, Chengdu did have a temple dedicated to Lü Dongbin, but it was already decrepit at that time. That's why local officials decided to use the Lüzu Hall of the Archannan instead. The elevation to the state cult shrine was prestigious, but it also imposed a heavy economic burden on the monastery. In 1849, the official status of a public monastery, or Shifang Conglin, was bestowed upon the Archannan by the provincial administration. Although repeatedly facing financial difficulties, owing to the increasing number of resident monks and the expenses of the offerings to Lü Dongbin, the Archannan nevertheless became one of the most important monastic centers of the Leoman lineage in southwest China. From 1887 to 1947, more than 60 large-scale ordinations were conducted in the Archannan, with a total of more than 6,000 Taoists receiving the precepts. The Archannan was also a major publication center of Taoist books and collections. Toward the end of the 19th century, under the supervision of Abbot Yan Yonghe, the re-edition and reprint of the most important Taoist anthology of the Qing dynasty, Daozang Jiyao, was launched. The carving of the wooden printing blocks was a huge task, spanning 15 years, and was finally finished under Wang Fuyang, the successor of Yan Yonghe. The new edition was titled Chongkan Daozang Jiyao, Re-edited Essentials of the Taoist Canon, and most of its printing blocks have been preserved until today. The Archannan ran its own publishing house, named Bidong Shanfang, Mountain Retreat of the Emerald Cavern, selling Taoist scriptures, ritual manuals, and popular morality books. In the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the Archannan was still an independent monastery, however, closely connected to a spirit writing community named Yushu Daoyuan, or Cloister of the Jade Void, and the Leoman tradition. So it's time to say something about the Leoman tradition. So this tradition evolved from the teachings of the Confucian scholar Liu Yuan, who combined his Confucian erudition with the practice of Taoist self-cultivation, and eventually became one of the most influential personalities in late imperial Sichuan, commonly known as Chuanxi Fuzi, or Master of Western Sichuan. The leadership of the Leoman community, which developed into a quasi-religious movement during the 19th century, was handed down within the Liu family. Many temples in Sichuan were managed by this community, and most of these centers also contained charitable institutions and schools. Possibly due to its Confucian credo, the Leoman movement was not considered a heterodox sect in Qing and Republican times, and it flourished until the middle of the 20th century. Liu's doctrine was based on the merging of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist concepts, and of course the underlying idea of that was the so-called uniting the three teachings, or Sanjiao Heyi, which had become a dominant feature of Chinese thought and religion since the Song dynasty. So, furthermore, Liu Yuan considered it a historical fact that Confucius once traveled to the capital of the ancient Zhou state to seek Lao Tzu's instruction. He believed that Lao Tzu taught Confucius the ultimate method of self-cultivation, which was thereupon lost in mainstream Confucianism. It was Liu's destiny to recover this precious core of ancient wisdom. He once studied for 8 years with a Taoist hermit and eventually mastered the techniques of Taoist meditative self-cultivation, or Neidan. Legend has it that this Taoist hermit was an incarnation of Lao Tzu. It thus becomes clear why the Leoman community held Taoist sacred places, especially those directly connected with Lao Tzu, in high esteem and supported them. So Liu Yuan's his most important works, or his most representative works, were finally collected by his descendants and students and published under the title of Huaixuan Quanshu, or Collected Works from the Locust Tree Studio. So Liu Yuan also annotated and edited various religious scriptures, most of which belong to the Taoist tradition. The most outstanding example of his editorial activities is a canon of Taoist ritual texts, which was called Fayan Huizuan, or Collected Words of Ritual Methods. So, and Fayan Huizuan constituted the scriptural basis of a Taoist ritual lineage, which is still active today. And this is the so-called Fayantan tradition, also one of my research topics. So we can say that although the core of the Leoman tradition was Confucian scholarship, but they made use of Taoist inner alchemy or self-cultivation, developing their own secretly transmitted method of self-cultivation, the so-called Qingyang Gong, or exercises of tranquil nurturing. And on the other hand, they made use of Taoist ritual and created their own Taoist ritual tradition called Fa Yan Tan, or altar of ritual words. So the Leoman tradition thus combined the characteristics of a scholarly circle and a religious community, spreading Confucian learning, moral values, and the technique of meditative self-cultivation, finally constituting an important part of Sichuan civil society. Leoman's core community and the residents of the Liu family were in Chengdu, where Liu Yuan had settled in 1807, but there were also many branch communities in other parts of Sichuan, and probably also in other provinces. In the city of Chengdu, 2 Buddhist monasteries became Leoman community temples, not only providing space for religious activities, but also housing Leoman's charitable institutions and schools and publishing houses. So apart from their own temples, the Leoman community generously supported other, chiefly Taoist sanctuaries, the most prominent being the Qingyang Gong, Wuhouci, and Archannan. So as you can see here on this slide, the Yanqing Si and Shengshou Si were owned and managed by the Leoman community. So, and they are something which could be called Leoman Jia Miao. The Yanqing Si was actually situated right opposite of the Liu family residence, and the Shengshou Si at Junpingjie, which is in the south of today's People's Park in Chengdu. Yeah, but other temples like Qingyang Gong and Archannan were not owned by the Leoman community, but they were patronized by the Leoman community or even co-managed. So I would like to cite Michael Walsh, who in his study Sacred Economies wrote the following: erecting a stele was an expensive and lengthy process involving many people. When a stele was erected, people knew what it was, even if many could not read it. A stele was a powerful form of cultural capital for both the donor and the recipient, a structure that projected prestige, articulated a process of naming, and signified knowledge and power, unquote. So when donors and patrons had steles erected inside a sanctuary or composed inscriptions for that purpose, their aim was to document religious merit or gongde achieved through renovations or other endowments, but also to emphasize the prestige of the patron and the institution. So we can safely assume that those patrons had considerable influence on the management of the relevant religious institutions, and in many cases were members of an officially recognized leadership. Liu Yuan and his descendants bequeathed many inscriptions to Taoist sanctuaries, but only a small part of the original stone steles or wooden tablets has been preserved. When the Archannan printed the anthology Chongkan Daozhang Jiyao in the early 20th century, 5 Leoman inscriptions were included in the collection. It is indeed possible that the Leoman community was involved in the publishing work of this anthology. While Abbot Yan Yonghe led the editorial team, the laymen He Longxiang and Peng Hanran were the actual editors of Chongkan Daozhang Jiyao. According to Liu Bogu, Liu Yuan's great-grandson, He and Peng most likely were Leoman adherents, although there is no written evidence for that. Furthermore, Peng Hanran hailed from Xinjin district, which was a stronghold of the Leoman tradition. The inscriptions in question, authored by Liu Yuan and one of his sons, were included in the relevant sections of the anthology, Qingyang Gong Beiji and Archannan Beiji. With one exception, the inscriptions were authored to commemorate renovation or rebuilding projects in these Taoist temples, and we can be sure that the Leoman community was the major sponsor in all cases. This pertains particularly to the Qingyang Gong, in whose management the Leoman community was obviously involved. None of the original steles is extant. It is beyond doubt that all of them were destroyed after the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Leoman movement was stigmatized as a reactionary secret society and openly suppressed in several localities. Although there is no evidence of active suppression in the city of Chengdu, the Leoman community was certainly forced to stop all public activities and ceased to exist as an organized group. It is also worth mentioning that none of the major centers of the Leoman tradition survived the communist modernization of Chengdu. The Liu family's residence, as well as the two community temples, though being of great cultural value, were razed to the ground and not a trace of them remained. So it goes without saying that the Leoman inscriptions in Chengdu's Taoist temples suffered the same fate, and we may well assume that traces of the Leoman tradition were wiped out on purpose. However, the Chinese have a tradition of collecting and publishing inscriptions, and the editors of Chongkan Daozang Jiyao included these precious texts in their anthology. So we will now begin to have a look at the inscriptions themselves. So among the Leoman inscriptions contained in Chongkan Daozang Jiyao, there is only one which is dedicated to the Archannan and has been included in the section Archannan Beiji of the anthology. So Liu Yuan's Bi Dong Zhen Ren Mu Bei, the tombstone inscription for the real man of the Emerald Cavern, was composed in 1830 and commemorates the renovation of the tomb of Chen Qingjue, the founding patriarch of the Bi Dong sub-branch of Leoman. It is thus obvious that the Liu family and the Leoman community did also support the Archannan, although their relation to the latter was not as close as to the Qingyang Gong. In this text, Liu Yuan stated clearly that, outside of the sages and worthies, there is nothing like so-called divine immortals. 圣贤之外，无所谓神仙也. And in this spirit, he summarized Chen Qingjue's life and success. I quote, "Today, his disciples are even more numerous. Since they continue the work of Gentleman Chen and commemorate his virtue, they set up a stone tablet and repaired his tomb and asked me to write an inscription for it. Now, I was not able to learn all the details of the gentleman's life. Yet, since he was treated by Shengzu, the Kangxi emperor, with such respect, he must have been an outstanding person. It was thus proper that he lived a long life in this world, guiding future generations." From 1808 to 1817, then, the Qingyang Gong underwent an extensive renovation. Liu Yuan had already taken up residence in Chengdu at that time, and his community began to play an important role in the development of the Qingyang Gong. After repair works were finished, Liu composed the Chongxiu Qingyang Gong Beiji to commemorate this meritorious deed. So toward the end of the inscription, we read the following. Qin Fuming, the local Taoist registrar, bemoaned the disrepair this temple had fallen into, and he initiated the raising of donations. We had all walls and buildings inside and outside completely renovated. Work commenced in winter of the 13th year of the Jiaqing era and was finished in the 5th year of the 22nd year. The approximate cost amounted to over 6,000 taels, it could be said that this was an arduous and tortuous project. Now that work has been finished, and men of merit from near and far should definitely write about it, I was asked to compose this inscription. I therefore recounted the meaning of this sacred place to inform future generations about it. So Liu Yuan was closely connected with members of the religious administration, like Qin Fuming, head of the local Taoist registry or Daohui Si, and it is beyond doubt that the Liu family and the Leoman adherents were among the main sponsors of this renovation. In his inscriptions, Liu always took the liberty of criticizing those aspects of the Taoist religion he considered overly magical or superstitious, reinterpreting them in Neo-Confucian terms. This also pertains to Lao Tzu, whom Liu viewed as a sage of antiquity in the Confucian manner, rather than a divinity. Now, we will come back to this issue. So as to the origins of the Qingyang Gong, Liu did not mention the encounter between Lao Tzu and Yin Xi in his inscription. Instead, he refers to Lao Tzu's transmission of sacred scriptures to Zhang Daoling, the founding patriarch of Celestial Master Taoism or Tianshi Dao. This transmission of the core scriptures of the cult of the southern and northern Dipper constellations reportedly took place in 155 at a location in Chengdu not far away from today's Qingyang Gong. It appears thus that Liu Yuan located the origins of the Qingyang Gong in the Eastern Han Dynasty. The Chongxiu Qingyang Gong Sanyuan Dian Beiji, written in 1815 by Liu Yuan, commemorated the rebuilding of the hall dedicated to the three officers or Sanguan of heaven, earth, and water, who belong to the earliest Taoist pantheon. The Leoman community promoted the cult of the three officers at various localities, building or renovating temple halls housing their images. Liu Yuan referred to them as Sanyuan Tianzun, heavenly worthies of the three primes, and regarded them as embodiment of primordial forces. Liu wrote the following: "The Grey Goat Market, Qingyang Si, is a relic of Lao Tzu. In former times, it had a hall of the three primes, which has now been rebuilt by adherents of our community. Work commenced in the 4th month of the 19th year of the Jiaqing era and was finished in the 11th month of the following year. Expenses amounted to over 420 taels. Their meritorious service can indeed be praised as unfailing." The construction of the Three Primes Hall was part of the renovation between 1808 and 1817. However, it appears that the Three Primes Hall was financed solely by the Leoman community, and it was also finished earlier than the rest of the temple complex. So by means of this sub-project, the Leoman community possibly sought to strengthen their influence in the early phase of their patronage of the Qingyang Gong. Just as all activities of the Leoman community, their patronage of the Qingyang Gong and other temples outlived Liu Yuan and continued into the middle of the 20th century. Between 1873 and 1882, the Qingyang Gong underwent another major restoration, which was subsidized by the Leoman community. After the rebuilding had been finished, Liu Yuan's 4th son, Liu Guiwen, composed the Qingyang Gong Chongxiu Sanqing Dian Bagua Ting Beiji to commemorate this meritorious deed. Liu Guiwen had passed the Jinshi or Metropolitan Graduate Examination in 1877 and served the Qing dynasty in several offices. He spent over 20 years in the capital Beijing, where he befriended many outstanding intellectuals. So due to his official career, Liu Guiwen never acted as head of the Leoman community, but given his literary talent, it was nevertheless his duty to write the inscription commemorating the restoration of this important sanctuary in his hometown. His inscription contains a lively description of the Qingyang's rebuilding in the late 19th century, during which the Taoist temple received its present appearance. So we read, in the spring of the Guiyou year, then the Taoists had just entered the hall and recited sacred scriptures. A roof beam in front of the shrine of the three clarities, the major divinities representing the Tao, the scriptures, and the masters, suddenly broke and fell down, punching a deep pit into the ground. Although the distance between the shrine and the table with the sacred books measured merely 2 odd feet, both remained totally undamaged. In this incident, the might of the divinities was clearly evident. Abbot Chen Jiaozhong was weighed down with sorrow, fearing the expenses of a renovation would be too high. We then invited all of our adherents to widely collect donations. The benefactors gave generously, everybody being busy with the collection. We thereupon gathered workers and prepared building materials, choosing only the hardest wood and the most solid stone. The Hall of the Three Clarities, as well as the Pavilion of the 8 Trigrams, were completely rebuilt. We further used surplus materials to repair the purple gold terrace, the location of the Tangwang Dian, the birth of Laozi terrace, and the expounding the doctrine terrace, all structures exceeding their former size. As to old structures like the Clouds and Water Refectory, the Ancestor Hall, and the sanctuary of the Tao, a kind of meditation cloister, the area was already cramped and the buildings could collapse any time. All were reconstructed and completely renewed. Work commenced in the 12th year Guiyou of the Tongzhi era and was finished in the 8th year Renwu of the Guangxu era. Expenses amounted to over 30,000 silver dollars. This can also be called a tortuous and arduous project. So Liu Guiwen's inscription has been carved on a new stele in the year 2000, which is now located in front of the Sanqing Dian. However, very few people know that this text actually documents a second phase of the Leoman patronage over the Qingyang Gong, spanning the last decades of the Qing dynasty. The year 1905 saw the abolishment of the imperial examination system, Keji, dramatically weakening the significance of Confucian erudition in China. However, the Leoman tradition was thriving. The Leoman patriarchs continued to uphold traditional learning, and it is probably no coincidence that they published the first edition of Huaixuan Quanshu in 1905 with imperial approval. In the same year, the Leoman community erected a huge stele inside the Qingyang Gong, inscribed with Liu Yuan's critical study of Laozi, Laozi Kao Bian or Laozi Bian. Among the 5 Leoman inscriptions preserved in the Chongkan Daozang Jiyao, this text is the only one which does not commemorate any concrete renovation project, but contains Liu's personal appraisal of Laozi. In 1905, the text Laozi Kao Bian was copied by the scholar and eminent Leoman adherent Yan Kai to be inscribed on the stele. The stele was erected under the auspices of the Qingyang Gong's abbot and with the support of the then Leoman patriarch and other donors. The original stele, of course, is not extant. Only a precious rubbing of this text survived in a private collection. Moreover, of course, the compilers of the Chongkan Daozang Jiyao included the Laozi Kao Bian in the section Qingyang Gong Beiji of the anthology. Thus, in the early 20th century, Liu Yuan's treatise served as a visible written artifact, manifesting the Leoman community's patronage of the Qingyang Gong. So, in his critical study of Lao Tzu, Liu Yuan strives to prove that Lao Tzu was once the teacher of Confucius. And he tries to verify this by extensive quotations. There are indeed many references in classical sources which confirm Liu Yuan's opinion, but modern sinology, however, has assigned these accounts to the realm of fiction. So the opening passage of Liu's study reads as follows. Lao Tzu was a scholar of hidden virtue. Since he dwelt in the world for a long time, he frequently changed his name. Ge Hong noted down in his reports on realized beings. In the times of the Yellow Emperor, he was named Guangchengzi. In the era of Yao, he was Wu Guangzi. Under the Yin dynasty, he served as archive administrator or Shouzang Li. And in Zhou times, he functioned as archivist, Zhu Xiashi. His words were vast like an ocean. The grand astrologer Sima Qian was not far away in time from Lao Tzu, and he states in his biography of Lao Tzu, some say the grand scribe Dan at the Zhou court or Lao Laizi were identical with Lao Tzu, but nobody in the world knows if this is true or not. At the end of the chapter, Sima Qian wrote, Lao Tzu was obscure and remote. Therefore, Lao Tzu was a recluse who hid away and appeared without regularity. For this reason, no one among the people of later generations ever grasped the truth about him. So it is obvious that Liu Yuan first and foremost viewed Lao Tzu as a sage of antiquity in the Confucian manner, and not as a divinity in the conventional sense. Yet at the same time, Liu Yuan seems to accept the old Taoist teachings of Lao Tzu's transformations, which holds that Taishang Laojun, the highest Lord Lao, the deified Lao Tzu, appears throughout the ages as the teacher and savior of humankind. So, and now we can have a short look at a small part of the rubbing. Anyway, well, this is these are high resolution pics. I only took the last piece of this inscription rubbing here in my presentation. You can see it on the left. And because it is very interesting, only on the rubbing you can find the names of the donors. In Chongkan Daozang Jiao, only the calligrapher is mentioned, but not the other donors. So among them, all the people who sponsored the stele, we find Yan Kai, of course, the calligrapher. Then Liu Beiwen, Liu Yuan's sixth son and the then patriarch of the Leoman community. Liu Xianying, a grandson of Liu Yuan and one of the most famous scholars in Chengdu at that time. And Liu Xianjun, another grandson of Liu Yuan, who would take over leadership of the Leoman community in 1914 and lead it until his death in 1935. The creation of the stele was supervised by Abbot Liu Jiaobin, who was not a relative of Liu Yuan or his family, but also a Leoman adherent. So, Leoman's influence on the Qingyang Gong can be divided into three phases. The first phase correlates with the renovation between 1808 and 1817, during which Liu Yuan and his community were among the leading donors, and they obviously also participated in the planning of the project. Apart from the inscriptions Chongxiu Qingyang Gong Beiji and Chongxiu Qingyang Gong Sanyuan Dian Beiji, other sources also confirm this early phase of the Leoman patronage. So, for example, the literary historian and author Lu Qian, who wrote a treatise called Huaixuan Xuelue, Brief Account of Huaixuan Learning. And in his treatise, following a short description of Liu's life and teachings, Lu lists Liu Yuan's most important disciples and also provides information on their family backgrounds, writings, and students. One of Liu Yuan's close disciples listed by Lu was Yang Guangyu from Wenjiang district. Yang Guangyu was noted for his commitment to charitable work, and he was initiated by Liu Yuan in person. Lu Qian's account has yet another interesting detail about Yang Guangyu. We read, the Qingyang Gong in the west of the provincial capital, Chengdu, was managed by him. He was wise and just in providing for the temple. In harmony with other people, yet not appeasing, he enjoyed leading others to act benevolent. With his patience and sincerity, he transformed the bright and the dull. Since Yang was one of Liu Yuan's close disciples, it is very likely that he organized the renovation of the Qingyang Gong between 1808 and 1817. However, the text does not disclose which domains of the temple management Yang Guangyu actually participated in, nor the specific period or duration of his engagement. The second phase of Leoman patronage became manifest in the extensive renovations between 1873 and 1882, which were related in the inscription Qingyang Gong Chongxiu San Qingdian Bagua Ting Beiji by Liu Guiwen. The present appearance of the Qingyang Gong is based on this rebuilding project in the late 19th century. However, we do not know whether or not the Leoman patronage was continuous and what concrete role it played in the management of the Qingyang Gong. In the first half of the 20th century, or maybe even earlier, several abbots of the Qingyang Gong were Leoman adherents. This does not conflict with their status as Taoist monks and abbots, since initiation into the Leoman tradition was open to people of all backgrounds and professions. Liu Yuan's great-grandson, Liu Bogu, remembers 3 of them. He had heard that the above-mentioned abbot Liu Xiaobin was a Leoman adherent. As to the following abbots, Zhao Yong'an and Chen Yongdong, Liu Bogu definitely knows that they were initiated into the Leoman tradition. A very close connection between the Leoman community and the Qingyang Gong characterized the third phase, the Republican era. Liu Bogu, who in his childhood and youth experienced the tradition of the Liu family and the activities of the Leoman community firsthand, confirms that all the time until 1949, Leoman adherents and the Liu family assisted in the management of the Qingyang Gong. So according to Mr. Liu's statements, the Qingyang Gong was a hereditary temple, or Zisun Miao, whose resident monks belonged to a distinct line of transmission and where the position of abbot was directly assigned to a personal disciple by the former abbot. The Taoists of the Qingyang Gong belonged to the Lungmen order, but they did not strictly adhere to the abstinence rules of Quanzhen Taoism, which means that they were allowed to consume meat and alcoholic drinks. By contrast, the neighboring Archannan was a public monastery, a Shifang Conglin, whose resident Taoists abode by strict monastic discipline, and whose abbot was authorized to conduct large-scale ordinations, the Chuanjie. Therefore, and this is really funny, Liu Bogu sometimes described the status of the Archannan in those times as orthodox Zhengzong in comparison with the Qingyang Gong. Liu Yuan, his family, and his disciples were among the most important benefactors or shizhu of the Qingyang Gong, as well as the Archannan, but their relation with the Qingyang Gong was particularly close. Beginning in late Qing times, all major renovations of the Qingyang Gong were financed by the Liu family and the Leoman community. Liu Bogu recalls that the originally not extant statues of the 3 clarities or the Sanqing in the temple's main hall were huge and had been erected under the guidance of Tan Daoheng, who was a close disciple of Liu Yuan. The patriarchs of the Leoman community were major patrons of the Qingyang Gong. Thus, in case of internal decisions, for example, the appointment of a new abbot, the Taoists had to obtain their approval. At least in this late phase of the Leoman patronage, the Qingyang was actually dependent on the Leoman community. To be sure, the Qingyang was officially run by the resident Leoman Taoists, but the Leoman community participated in its management. Liu Borgu recalls that each time when members of the Liu family visited the Qingyang, they were always feasted and treated with utmost respect by the Taoists. In the left part of the temple complex, which unfortunately is currently thoroughly remodeled, once existed a shrine of donors, Gong, housing memorial tablets for Liu Yuan, his descendants, and other important Leoman donors. Every year in the first lunar month, the Taoists conducted an offering liturgy for the donors called Ji Gong, to which representatives of the Liu family were specially invited. According to Liu Borgu's memories, the relation between Leoman and the Archannan was rather loose and in no way comparable to that with the Qingyang. However, it is beyond doubt that the Leoman community also supported the Archannan and was obviously even involved in the latter's publishing activities. Although the participation of Leoman adherents in the editorial work of the Chongkan Daozhangjiyao has yet to be verified, there are still other pieces of evidence, like certain books with forewords by Leoman community members, or inscriptions inside the Archannan, which were authored by members of the Liu family. So both the Qingyang and the Archannan still housed over 100 Taoists in Republican times and were relatively prosperous. The Twin-Monasteries functioned very differently, represented different lines of transmission, and had different connections to the Leoman community, but both played their specific part in the history of urban Taoism in modern Sichuan. While the Archannan was a center of Leoman ordination and Taoist publishing of paramount importance, the Qingyang played a leading role in the Taoist Association of Sichuan. So there is no doubt that the connections both sanctuaries maintained with Leoman and other communities were an indispensable part of their history and development. Yet these topics are rarely touched upon in the research literature on the Twin Monasteries. The Leoman tradition and other groups outside the monastic mainstream have been deliberately marginalized and ignored in the study of Sichuan Taoism, leaving a very incomplete picture of the latter's history and culture. So this part of the history of Sichuan Taoism has yet to be written. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Volker.